Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. The end of Dragonflight is fast approaching, with the next chapter of World of Warcraft set to take over our lives later this year. And as with all new expansions, we expect plenty of new zones to explore, treasures to find, new content features, and most importantly, new class changes along the way. We already know that every single class spec in the game will get access to new hero towns, which will further transform and modify existing playstyles. But we also expect plenty of talent reworks, class adjustments, and additional tuning to come along the way. I'm someone who's tracked the class development closely all throughout Dragonflight, and I've always enjoyed the process of learning how other classes get to play. Enough to level 1 of every class in the game, so I can be there to experience any big revamps or talent changes we've seen over the last few content updates. Recently, I decided to put a list together with a handful of changes that I would love to see for every one of our classes, either before or by the time the next expansion releases. And today, I wanted to share that list with all of you and go over what will make every one of the iconic WoW classes better, in my opinion, as we slowly advance towards the next chapter of World of Warcraft. But right before that, most of you guys watching the videos on this channel are still not subscribed. And the more I mention it, the more of you guys do subscribe. So if you enjoy the regular content, you might as well hit the button below. I first want to start off with one of my favorite melee classes, the Death Knight, where we saw specs like Blood, Frost, and Unholy go through a variety of different changes, from the very first raid tier to the most recent one for the patch 10.2, where they adjusted the damage profile of Unholy in one of the best ways imaginable. Ideally, there are two things that I would primarily want to see from this class. Death Knights are incredibly flavorful, whether you're playing a sanguine blood Death Knight siphoning the life force out of your enemies, spreading plagues and undeath as an unholy spec, or shattering your enemies' skulls with bone-breaking obliterates. Where this flavor doesn't quite meet the mark is in its rune forge system, which is pretty elementary. You have a bunch of runes that you can imbue on your weapons, where other classes would buy enchants on the auction house. So for Death Knights, you have a variety of Death Knight only effects that could be slapped on your weapons. Fallen Crusader, which is a primary rune most Death Knights play, is kind of like the end game rune, and maybe you would use Unending Thirst as a new leveling player, but that's really about it. Razor Ice and Hysteria might get some play as a Frost Death Knight when you dual wield, but Sanguination, Spell Warden, Apocalypse, and Stone Skin Gargoyle barely get any use. Like, what if they took the glyph of Apocalypse, for example, which buffs the output of your primary ghoul, and allowed that glyph to be used for Frost and Blood Death Knights to now wield a ghoul as a pet instead of just as a temporary companion. You could even have the ghoul provide various buffs to the Death Knight to increase their damage, like for Frost, or put a bunch of debuffs on enemies as they cleave them all at once for the Blood Death Knight to reduce damage taken. I feel like there's a lot of creativity that could be harvested out of this rune forge system in order to give Death Knights some flavorful choices of weapons, but also some functional uses besides slapping a Fallen Crusader on your weapons and then forgetting about it altogether. Another way I would adjust Death Knights going forward is to improve Death Knight's identity as a class. Put the Death Knight first before the specs of Blood, Unholy, and Frost. As it stands, all three specs of Death Knight are quite unique, which is a good thing in a way. It allows Unholy Death Knights to focus on dots and pet management, while Frost is looking for big obliteration procs, and Blood Death Knight utilizes their runic power to escape danger with calculated death strikes. For the most part, Death Knights share only a handful of abilities, such as Anti-Magic Zone, or maybe their Grip, or Death and Decay, but that's kinda where it ends, and I would love to see more of that Death Knight core utility brought up a bit to give all three specs some fun tools that all of them could play with. Like, for example, Gorfian's Grasp doesn't really get too much use as a Blood Death Knight, but what if it became the ultimate Death Grip ability available for all specs, which could create so many cool synergies between Death Knight's Gorfian's Grasp and other classes' control-based abilities? Or what if they were to unprune Summoning Army to give it back to all three Death Knight specs, which used to be a core capability of all three playstyles? Visually, there's something awesome about being able to summon your undead horde behind you as the commanding Blood Death Knight rushes straight into the boss's clutches. I feel like all of these additions not only would be useful when it comes to base gameplay or improving Death Knight's output, but also adds quite a bit of flavor and helps reinforce that Death Knight stalwart identity. Up next, we have the class of Demon Hunter, and sadly, I don't have too many suggestions of how we would fix them since they recently got a rework for the patch 10.2 and they've been incredibly fun to play since. Most players are very happy with the design of this class thus far. Havoc offers a fun, fast-paced, and an aggressive playstyle that's also fairly flexible when it comes to players making some of the meaningful choices within their talent tree. And for the Vengeance, the Sigil tank playstyle is kind of a strong build that offers plenty of control, better offensive power, while maintaining high mobility. The rework makes it very difficult to offer new suggestions on how to better the class since it feels pretty good to play so far. But I do think there are some new suggestions and ideas we can find in the PvP talent section. In the past, and particularly for Dragonflight, we saw a variety of class PvP only abilities reward into class talents, which allowed unique PvP only mechanics to make their way into raids and even dungeons. Demon Hunters are no different, as the PvP talents offer them magic-resistant abilities, such as Cleanse by Fire or even Reverse Magic, which could be a strong new defensive option, and would help highlight the Demon Hunters' anti-magic themes of the entire class. We even have incredibly strong utility spells such as Blood Moon Passive, which transforms Devour Magic into an AoE purge rather than a single target purge, kind of like a Blood Elf racial, which will be incredibly powerful in M+ content. Then we have talents such as Glimpse, which would be kind of strong, offering some skill expression to Demon Hunters who are able to maneuver their way around a battlefield, using the Vengeful Retreat ability to give them momentary protection and even immunity from crowd control abilities. Up next, we have the class of Druid, where I primarily want to see two things done going forward. One, I want to make certain class utility abilities easier to spec into. Primarily, I'm looking at things like Interrupt, Innervate, and even Hibernate. The class of Druid embodies flexibility. If you're taking damage, you shift into bear form to protect yourself from danger. For a quick escape, you shift into travel or a cat form and dash out of sight. And if you want to drop the stars from the sky upon your foes, you shift into a powerful Moonkin form so you can better harness your arcane and natural abilities. But when it comes to their talent tree, picking up abilities such as your Kick, Innervate, or even Hibernate has a bit of a tax attached to it, forcing you to pick up certain talents that you may not ever use ever in combat in order to be able to grab some of these unique tools. And I feel like this area could be easily improved upon. But while we were talking about all of these abilities that you have to pick up to grab certain unique skills in your talent tree, why aren't some of those hybrid abilities that you have to grab more meaningful? Like if you want to play a Feral Druid that briefly shifts into a Boomkin just to do a little bit of damage from range, or you go to Swiftman your allies and Wild Growth them to help them escape danger from bosses, or if you are the target of boss aggression and need to go into bear form so you can tank up some of this damage, why can't we find ways to reward you utilizing hybrid abilities to further support your main role? Think of it as a reverse protector of the pack, where you are rewarded for doing your primary role with some hybrid skills. What if for doing hybrid abilities and hybrid stuff, it buffed your primary role damage, storing up in a number, and when you shoot back into your primary role like a Feral Druid cat form or Guardian Druid bear form, and you use one of your Guardian or Feral abilities, all that stored damage now gets applied to the next hit. Otherwise, it would feel like you're kind of punished for shifting out of cat form to save an ally, but now your overall damage went down a notch. But if we instead rewarded players utilizing their entire class kit by allowing them to catch up to their DPS that they would have lost, I think this would give Druid players more opportunity for skill expression, really utilizing the hybrid skills in a variety of different situations without necessarily punishing the player for going out of their way. Up next, we got the most recent addition of the Draconic Evoker. And ever since the spec of augmentation was added halfway through the second season of Dragonflight, it seems that just about everybody playing Evoker is mostly augmentation, which has dwindled the numbers we've seen of preservation and devastation specs. What helps make Aug unique compared to the other Evokers is the buff-focused playstyle. Instead of primarily doing damage, they instead buff the effectiveness of everybody else around them, granting them additional primary stats and even increased critical strike chances, providing them with various damage procs and even enhancing the armor of their tanks. But beyond that, they also bring in unique augmentation-only abilities that none of the other Evoker specs have. Which means if you are going to bring an Evoker in your raid or dungeon, it might as well be augmentation since they bring the most amount of tools to the team. This is why I think some of those abilities could be reintegrated into the class talent tree to give devastation and preservation a bit more of an even footing. And there's plenty of suggestions as to what abilities could be easily brought over. I feel like abilities such as Spatial Paradox, even the Timelessness buff, or even the unique Augmentation Cheat Death ability could be changed into Evoker general class talents instead. This would allow Aug to remain plenty unique as it is, while giving preservation and devastation more of a fair chance when it comes to being picked for group content. Then we have the class of Hunter, and generally I would love to see a talent revamp for all 3 Hunter's specs, for the class tree as well as the individual spec trees. For the most part, the class talents haven't really changed since the release of Dragonflight, and when we've seen other success stories such as the Rogue revamp, the Demon Hunter revamp, the Mage revamp, or even the early Paladin revamp, all of those have generally been good for those classes, and I feel like Hunters are kind of currently falling behind without a proper rework. Though there are some easy suggestions that I think could be implemented just into the next expansion. Take for example Hunter's Mark, which could be made so much easier to use going forward. For example, it's a mostly single target ability, so what if it had some sort of an AoE component where you could just mark multiple targets if they're standing close together? Or not have some of its damage drop off beyond 80% of enemies' health so that the buff can remain relevant in some of the execute boss encounters. Another one would be moving Wailing Arrow from the spec trees of Beast Mastery and Marksman into the class tree instead, where a lot of the other utility abilities can preside. Because as it stands, Wailing Arrow is going to mean a damage loss for either of those 2 specs. But if it were to be moved into the class tree, made a little bit more instant with less travel time so you can better react to silence enemies on the spot, then I think you would see more players getting use out of the arrow ability. Lastly, for Marksmanship Hunters specifically, I would like to see changes to their Lone Wolf talent to let them choose which pet buff they would like to provide for themselves. Marksmanship Hunters are lone wolves that don't necessarily play with a pet, rather parking themselves at a long range to snipe enemies from a distance. But it doesn't really make sense to punish them by excluding some of the pet-specific utility that they may be able to pick from if they were to play with a pet, such as the choice between Leech and Bloodlust, Fortitude and a stamina buff, but also Master's Call and movement speed. At the very least, the hunter should be able to choose which one of these buffs and passives they would want to have before the start of combat, so they don't have to lose out on certain utility and have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to group endgame. Up next, we have the class of Mage, and honestly, I was having a bit of a hard time trying to find suggestions for this one in particular. Currently, I find all 3 specs plenty fun to play, whether it's Arcane, Frost, or Fire. But I do think that all 3 specs probably could use some more visually interesting abilities and even new mechanics that could be gleaned from the PvP talents. For Arcane, I think Arcanosphere would be a unique spell to bring into the PvE toolkit, with a knockback which would be quite good in Mythic Plus, but also with movement skills such as Ice Flows, being able to channel up and build up an Arcanosphere I imagine would be kind of easy to use. Greater Pyroblast would be the pick for Fire Mages for me, as the talent could potentially even benefit from other talents that enhance Pyroblast as well, which would give you kind of a long cast but a high impact single target ability to burst your targets, or maybe just run Ring of Fire for additional AoE. For Frost Mages, there's actually a lot of cool ideas, from Concentrated Coolness to better control your orb position, or Frostbomb, which could be fun in AoE fights, or even Snowdrift, which would give him additional utility in Mythic Plus content. With the right positioning, you could stun multiple enemies at once while being able to shatter them with all of your spells and abilities. Up next, we have the class of Monk, which feels generally pretty good to play, whether you're playing Mistweaver, Windwalker, or even Brewmaster. Just like Mages, I kind of found it difficult to find some new suggestions for this class in particular, though one aspect that I don't think would be easy to fix that I can talk about is how the Monk class interacts with certain stats. For example, stats like Haste on Brewmaster or Windwalker can feel kind of awkward to use since there's not too much interaction, or Mastery as Mistweaver for instance, at least when it comes to PvE endgame content. But I'm not exactly sure as to what kind of suggestions that I could make as someone who doesn't main a monk. But I think some kind of better stat scaling is definitely needed. Unless they found a way to have these stats affect other aspects of your gameplay, not just auto attacks and energy regen. Like, what if Haste helped reduce heavily the CDR on some of your brews as a Brewmaster? Or maybe if Haste increased the proc rate of certain abilities as a Windwalker, or something along those lines. Besides this, I also did take a look at the Monk PvP talents, and I think there's some cool thematic ideas which could be integrated to all 3 specs. For Brewmaster, we have talents such as Hod Trub or even Nimble Brew. Trub used to be a damage and a CC ability that we actually get to use back in BFA, and it worked really well. So imagine reintegrating that one back into the playstyle wouldn't be all that difficult. Nimble Brew would also be a very unique M+ utility for Brewmasters to bring. Of course, all of these abilities would need to be retuned, and maybe would need to have a different cooldowns attached to some of them, but I think it would definitely add some new mechanics to a Brewmaster playstyle. For Mistweavers, I thought that maybe a Castweaver playstyle could be more viable in M+ content with Zen Spheres, which will require also additional tuning, but being able to apply a healing buff on an ally and a survivability debuff on an enemy, while also finding ways to help you contribute to group damage without necessarily attacking on your own, would make Castweavers, I think, a bit more interesting to play in dungeon content. Then we have the Thunderous Focus PvP talent, which grants you a knock as well as a refund on roll plus a heal, which I think could be interesting if used in specific situations. For Moonwalkers, I couldn't really decide whether I like Storm Spirit Strikes in order to give yourself additional cleave with Fist of Fury, or Tiger's Eye Brew to bring back a Mr. Pandaria-esque playstyle. Of course, all of these abilities would require additional tuning, but the unique ramp up mechanic and the delayed burst of Tiger's Eye Brew could allow monks to ramp up into huge burst windows, where most classes would try to pop their cooldowns in the opener, and that's kind of where majority of the damage comes from. The monk instead would have the inverse of that playstyle, which would allow them to do more and more damage the longer an encounter would go on. Finally, I think Mighty Ox Kick would be an awesome addition just for the sake of fun. Personally, I find the idea of monks juggling scary dungeon elites up into the air pretty humorous, and I think it would be really cool for the extra disruptions the monks could utilize against caster foes. Up next, we have the class of Paladin, and while working on this video, I found it difficult to find Paladin-only problems, class problems, to fix for War Within. The class on its own is a fun pickup that's very easy to recommend for new players, even if you're looking for a fun ult to casually do some group activities with, or if you're looking for a fresh new main to take over your life for the next upcoming expansion. All three Paladin specs are quite unique, however, with their own unique problems to solve going forward. Because of this, I decided to come up with some kind of a solution for each and every single one of these specs. For Protection Paladin, I think the Consecration defensive buffs are good, and the amount of passives that you get from your talent tree make it one of the most passive tanks in the game, where you just shrug off damage like it's nothing, even without the use of cooldowns. However, you are stuck in one spot thanks to Consecration, and I'd love to see things like this lessened a little bit going forward. Consecration should be a fantastic button that you do want to press in dungeons and raids, but I don't think the spec should feel like you're limiting yourself to just that one spot of holy ground, otherwise you risk dying if you ever walk out of it. Ideally, I would just like to see a little bit more flexibility in where you can stand. Maybe allow the defensive value of Consecration to stay with you for a handful of seconds if you ever walk out of it, so that you can move around without really feeling too punished. Then we have Holy Paladins. Over the last few expansions, Holy Paladins' themes and identity has changed quite a bit, from an Avenging Crusader battle melee healer to the Light of the Martyr sacrificial healer, the Holy Light and Flash of Light caster paladin, or the Glimmer of Light healer. All four of these identities are clearly present in the current version of the Holy Paladin, and all of them are trying to do exactly the same role, which is specifically good spot healing in raids and dungeons. I feel going forward, Holy Paladins need some sort of an identity that unifies the spec, and they can build upon that identity and a solid baseline going forward with new talents, ideas, and even synergies to expand upon. Lastly, we have Retribution Paladins, which I think are incredibly fun, and there are not too many things I would want to change except for one. Right now, Paladins have to choose between good single target damage or fantastic AoE. Depending on how you talent your Paladin, you will either be really good in one, but you will suffer in the other aspect. So it might be better if there were some talents or some changes that give him a little bit more flexibility. Otherwise, it's an incredibly fun spec. Up next, we have the class of Priest, which I played on and off for Season 1 and Season 2, but I started playing it a lot more as of recently for the 10.2.5. I thought some of the recent changes the class has received have been generally good for all three specs, but there are only two recommendations that I can really make for this class in order to improve it further. For one, the class of Priest is the only class in the game without a proper interrupt ability, except for the silence that is available for Shadow Priest exclusively. And I think going forward, the class could probably use some kind of a unifying silence ability or some kind of an enemy spellcast lockout effect. It doesn't have to be an interrupt like rogues and mages and hunters, but some kind of a unique way to deal with spellcasting once in a while I think would be very much appreciated. Another change I would like to see going forward is for certain talents that are very much playstyle unique to be more functional for other specs. For example, Holy Priests utilize Prayer of Mending as a regular combat ability, but for Disc and Shadow, they don't really get much use out of it, let alone some of the other healing talents in the class talent tree. I think it'd be good to make some of these unique healing effects a little bit more hybridized. For example, if you do have a Shadow Priest that maybe specs into Prayer of Mending, maybe the Prayer of Mending can alter you in a way that it works for a Shadow, like maybe it affects 3 allies instead of just 1. And every time that it bounces between allies, it maybe builds you a bit of resources like Insanity, or even causes your Shadow Word Pains to flare up and do some AoE damage, and would allow certain off-healing abilities to do some kind of a damage as a playstyle option, allowing Shadow Priest to play around with certain holy and discipline effects, while mostly remaining in the realm of Shadow. We could even see certain simple talents like a reworked version of Inspiration that works with Mind Blast crits instead of flash heals and the like. And there's plenty of other talents that are very healer specific that could maybe be adjusted slightly so they're actually pretty functional for Shadow Priest as well. Alright, up next is the class of Rogue. I did actually do a video separately for some of the changes that I would love to see for this class for the War Within, so I'll have that video linked down in the description below if you want to check out a more detailed version of what I'd like to see for rogues going forward in the next expansion. But if I had to combine the one thing that all 3 specs could probably do better with going forward is cooldown management. Currently, all 3 specs are very cooldown focused, and if you mess up your cooldowns, you can lose out on quite a bit of damage as a rogue, which can be a little bit intimidating for some of the newer players. Assassination, for instance, is heavily invested into the Kingsbane ability, but it doesn't deal as much damage outside of it, and failing a Kingsbane setup or mistiming some of your cooldowns can be the difference between top damage or bottom damage. I think talents like Vicious Venoms and Sanguine Blade's talents could maybe be buffed in order to offer a little bit more of a sustained focused playstyle, which used to be part of the Assassination kit during the very first raid of this expansion. Subtlety is another spec that plays with so many different cooldowns, and the downtimes over these cooldowns all differ. Some are going to be 30 seconds downtime, while others have a 45 second CT, and others are going to be a minute, 1 minute, 0.5, or even 2 minute cooldowns that all kind of disalign from each other. And when you add Vanish cooldown reduction on top of it, it can really throw things off, and it makes it very difficult for new players to get into. And then we take the spec of Outlaw Rogue, which plays around the Vanish and Shadow Dance playstyles that used to manage cooldowns such as Adrenaline Rush, Between the Eyes, Blade Flurry, Ghost of Strike, Roll the Bones, while also playing around the rotational changes and minute adjustments that happen whenever you roll certain buffs from Roll the Bones. I think if anything, rogues probably could use a bit of a slow down and some kind of consistency when it comes to their damage output, or maybe do something similar to the Unholy Death Knights, where they can instead reduce the cooldown of certain major abilities while pulling back on that cooldown reduction element. Then we have the class of Shaman, where I have 2 main bullet points that I would love to see addressed going forward. First of all, I would love to have some kind of a standardization when it comes to totem buffs within raid content. Enhance currently has the monopoly on being the most broadened spec for group content because of Wind Fury. It brings all the other class utility but 1 extra totem. Restoration and Elemental, I fear, are going to continue to fall behind over time unless for some reason they're tuned to be significantly better than the ranged DPS or healer counterparts, giving them a unique totem like Wind Fury or something similar, maybe even a totem that exclusive buffs caster DPS classes would be an interesting step forward. So if let's say you have a melee squad that deals good physical damage, you could pair them with Enhanced Shaman to complete your melee loadout. Or if your raid has a strong range core, you can pair them together with an elemental instead. Or even better yet, allow shamans to pick which totems they get to provide, irrespective of their group, to give them even more flexibility in group content. My second bullet point would be to make some of their other utility totems feel better to use. Shamans have some of the best and some of the most unique utility in the game, and a lot of them come through your totems, which I love playing around. That being said, a lot of those useful totems did lose their luster and their popularity over time throughout this expansion. Like Stone Skin, which has very low usage in raids and even dungeons and may require some kind of a buff going forward to increase its popularity, or even the Healing Stream totem for elemental or enhancement. For Restoration, this totem is part of the core abilities, but for the other specs outside of PvP, it doesn't feel nearly as good to use and becomes even less and less worthy of a global to set it down. Tranquil Air and Poison Cleansing totem are also cool, but also very niche. Have some uses in very specific situations, but maybe there could be a way to make it more broad and more regularly activated instead of certain endgame activities. Next we have the class of Warlock, where as an entire core, the class of Warlock is incredibly fun. Plenty of utility, plenty of Warlock flavor baked into all their talents, plenty of defenses, and even good mobility if used correctly. However, all 3 specs of this class do have their own unique challenges to overcome going forward, starting with Affliction. which I think needs a bit more support towards their damage over time abilities. For example, refreshing agonies can be quite hard, especially in group content, and I would love to see for a shorter cooldown of the ability of Taint, so that managing agonies can be at least easier in large clusters of enemies. And while we're on the topic of damage over time abilities, I would love to see a bit better of a dot heavy profile for Affliction over the ability of Malefic Rapture. While Affliction does have quite considerable burst thanks to Malefic Rapture, it feels like all of your damage over time effects take a bit of a backseat and are mostly used to empower the effectiveness of your Malefic Rapture. Generally, I want Affliction dots to feel a lot better than they currently do. I want the dots to be the standout ability that deals majority of my damage instead of used as fuel for raptures. It's a unique flavor that Affliction has brought over the last few expansions, and I kind of want them to regain that kind of a profile going forward. Up next we have Destruction, where I think they could probably use a talent rework. Some of the more common problems of Destruction when it comes to picking the do nothing talents to get some of your best single target damage output. You have plenty of opportunities for wasted talents which could be spent elsewhere. Destruction Warlocks also have a talent tree that's been notoriously awkward to pass through since the release of this expansion, and I could see certain key abilities shifted or moved around the talent tree so they could be better flow when it comes to you making your way down towards the capstone options. Also, the talent of Havoc seems like such an iconic destruction specific ability that I would love to see it ripped out of the talent tree and given as a baseline option for the Destruction Warlock. For Demonology, I think the most recent rework was actually quite good. I love the recent changes to the transfer of power away from your Tyrant and some of your bigger cooldowns into your basic demons and some of your base spells and abilities. It feels better to play, it improves your AoE output, and makes every spell cast feel much more impactful. I would love to see even more demon summons as potential capstones going forward, like what if they were to remove the Pit Lord away from the Nether Portal and make him his own summonable demon, really fuel that fantasy of summoning creatures from the twisting Nether. And the last but definitely not least, we have the class of Warrior. Generally, I find warriors quite fun, strong, and tanky when it comes to endgame content, but a lot of players do say often that they don't bring enough to party utility. I played the class on and off the entire expansion, whether I'm raging and thrashing around on the Fury spec, going for big explosive executes and mortal strikes as arms, or holding down the bunker as protection. And the class does well when it's tuned numerically high, but sometimes it isn't, and that is where I do agree party-wide utility could be further improved. Similar to Death Knights, I think there could be more unifying abilities that all warriors could interact with, and I think the mechanic of shouts could be that answer. Warriors can do a lot of things with just their voice, whether it is to fortify their allies with Battle Shout, fortify their allies with Rallying Cry, and even literally pierce past their enemies with a draconic roar. And I think there's plenty of room for other shouts to also be available to the entire class. Take the Protection Warrior Demo Shout for example. What if instead of reducing your damage taken by enemies stricken by the shout, it reduces the damage those enemies do for a short moment? They can even be balanced to have a longer cooldown for Fury and Arms, and can even tune it to just how much damage it reduces so that it's not too broken. Disrupting Shout's Silence would be another good one as well, and can also be tuned with a longer cooldown so that it's not too busted in Mythic Plus scenarios. Maybe even add the PvP talent of Battlefield Commander to upgrade all of your shouts even further to increase their effectiveness, but also increase your overall group utility. It's a long one, but that was my whole list of some of the changes that I would love to see for every single one of our classes. At first I tried to keep this list mostly class specific rather than spec specific, but as I wrote the general script I noticed that some classes actually feel kind of good, and some of the issues are more playstyle oriented rather than the problem with the class itself. So I had to make some creative adjustments depending on the classes we were talking about. But I also want to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments down below for any one of the classes that you potentially plan to play in the War Within. What are some of the specific changes with talents or abilities or revamps or anything that you would want to see going forward for the next expansion? As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.